Read Japanese Literature. My name is Allison Fincher. Read Japanese Literature is a podcast about Japanese fiction and some of its best works. All the works we discuss are available in translation, so you can read along if you want. You can find out more at readjapaneseliterature.com. Welcome to Season 4. Before I get started, I want to offer a special thank you to all my listeners, but especially to Read Japanese Literature's paid Patreon supporters. I do the labor for Read Japanese Literature entirely unpaid, but it costs about $90 a month just to keep the podcast, episode pages, website, book lists, etc. running and publicly visible. That's before I buy the books and other resources I need to provide high-quality information about Japanese literature. These 30 folks who support Read Japanese Literature on Patreon keep Read Japanese Literature running and ad-free. You can join them at patreon.com/readjapaneseliterature. Today's episode has been rated mature. Just like our episode on writing from Okinawa, we'll be addressing a period of history that's pretty grim: the American attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki using nuclear weapons. As you might imagine, this episode will involve violence and some pretty serious themes. I won't be more graphic than necessary, but history sometimes isn't pretty. Again, as in our episode on writing from Okinawa, the writers and ideas today are really important, not only to Japanese literature and Japanese history, but also to human history. I encourage you to listen. One of our authors today commits suicide, and in the final third of our episode, we'll be discussing Kyoko Hayashi and her story, Masks of Whatchamacallit. That story involves descriptions of illness, including cancer, a marriage that probably qualifies as emotionally abusive, and a woman being coerced into having an abortion. On August 6, 1945, the 393rd Bombardment Squadron B-29 Enola Gay took off from Northfield, Tinian, one of the Mariana Islands recently retaken from the Japanese by American forces. After about 6 hours flight time, the plane arrived over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Hiroshima is located on Japan's main island of Honshu, along the coast of the Inland Sea. Only 3 men on the plane knew what the Enola Gay truly carried: an enriched uranium gun-type fission weapon otherwise known as Little Boy. In other words, the first nuclear weapon that would ever be deployed in war. At 8:09 Hiroshima time, the American bombardier released Little Boy. 44 seconds later, the bomb reached detonation height and exploded. No one is exactly sure how many people were killed by the bomb dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. It's likely that somewhere between 66 and 140,000 people were killed instantly, and that another 100,000 or more were injured. Later that day, U.S. President Harry Truman announced to the American people that 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped 1 bomb on Hiroshima. It is an atomic bomb. We are now prepared to obliterate more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have above ground in any city. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. With lines of communication between Tokyo and Hiroshima still severed, Truman's announcement was the first time government officials in Japan began to understand what had happened 800 kilometers or 500 miles to their west. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, the B-29 Boxcar lifted off from Tinian. This time, the primary target was Kokura, on the far north of the Japanese island of Kyushu. When defenses around Kokura proved to be a problem, the boxcar turned south toward its secondary target, Nagasaki. This time, the American plane carried a different kind of weapon, a plutonium implosion-type nuclear weapon nicknamed Fat Man. The bombardier dropped the bomb at 11:01 a.m. and it exploded 47 seconds later, 6 kilometers, almost 2 miles, northwest of the Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works, its planned target. The bomb actually exploded over Nagasaki's Urakami neighborhood, one of the most important Christian sites in Japan. It's only because the crew accidentally dropped the bomb into the narrow Urakami Valley that the damage and casualties weren't far more extensive. As in Hiroshima, there is still no consensus about the number of people killed by the American atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Immediate death estimates range from 22 to 75,000 people, with another 60,000 injuries. It took just days for Emperor Hirohito and his war cabinet to agree to surrender. On August 15th, Hirohito made his first ever radio broadcast announcing Japan's unconditional surrender to the people of Japan. The 6th paragraph of the address explicitly mentions the terrifying new weapon. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives, Hirohito said. If the war continued, he went on, the bomb could cause, quote, an ultimate obliteration of the Japanese nation, and it could certainly cause the total extinction of human civilization. Yeah, that's a pretty somber way to start out a podcast episode. But it's also what's at stake for the writers of atomic bomb literature. The deaths of more than 100,000 people, the instant erasure of entire cities, long-term health and social fallout we haven't even discussed yet, and a weapon that continues to threaten the very existence of the human race. We're going to start out today with a brief history of the development of the nuclear bomb, the story of its deployment in Japan and the aftermath. We'll move on to Genbaku Bungaku, in English, atomic bomb literature. We'll talk about its surprisingly controversial history in Japan, as well as some of its most influential authors from both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we'll end with a look at the life of Kyoko Hayashi and her novella, Masks of Whatchamacallit. Masks of Whatchamacallit is available to read online completely for free. I encourage you to give it a read. Again, it's free, and it's only 20 pages long. My understanding of the story of the atomic bomb was reshaped by reading Erika Kobayashi's Trinity, 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 translated into English by Brian Bergstrom. It's not so much a piece of atomic bomb literature as a piece of atomic literature or nuclear literature, although atomic bomb literature is very clearly a precursor to the novel. It's a book that's more of an exploration of the entire story of radioactivity and how big a part it plays in the narrative of human history. Trinity, Trinity, Trinity takes the atomic bomb narrative all the way back, not to the beginning of the 20th century or even the 19th century, but to the 15th century, back to St. Joachim's Valley in Bohemia, in what's now the Czech Republic. The silver mines in St. Joachim's Valley are the oldest in Europe, and it's in one of these mines that pitchblende was first discovered. Pitchblende is a brown or black mineral that contains uraninite. A German chemist named Martin Heinrich Klaproth isolated uranium from pitchblende in 1789, and the Curies, Polish Marie and French Pierre, used pitchblende to isolate radium in 1898. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, not only the Curies, but also many other big-name scientists were researching radioactivity and making discoveries at a truly remarkable rate. From a European perspective, World War II began with the German invasion of Poland in 1939. By 1939, scientists on both sides of the Atlantic were already working on the fission of uranium atoms. Fission means splitting apart atoms to release energy. By 1939, scientists also generally understood that it was theoretically possible to cause a massive atomic explosion, even if no one yet knew exactly how to do it. I don't want to go into too much technical detail about the development of the atomic bomb. American nuclear physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer is regarded as the father of the atomic bomb. He was the director of the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico, where the atomic bombs themselves were ultimately designed and tested. The Trinity test took place on July 16, 1945, with the force of 20,000 tons of TNT, many times what some of the scientists working on the project had expected. If you know much about World War II history, you may have noted that July 16, 1945, when the Trinity test took place, was a little late. It was more than 2 months after Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, the day the Allies formally accepted Germany's surrender. That means that if the United States intended to use the atomic bomb during World War II, Japan was really the only option. There remains some argument about whether there was ever a real possibility the U.S. would have deployed atomic weapons in Germany if scientists had managed to build the bomb in time. The answer is it's complicated. It seems reasonably clear that scientists thought Germany was the target for most of the time they were working on the project, but there are also memos dating to as early as 1943 that some military leaders were discussing Japan already as a better target. Given the trajectory of the war itself and the development of military technology after 1939, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt and UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill didn't even discuss using the nuclear bomb in Germany when they met in the fall of 1944. There was also the choice not to use the atomic bomb. There are still historians debating whether Japan would have surrendered without an Allied invasion. We're definitely not going to resolve that debate today. I will note that the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded in a 1946 report that, quote, based on a detailed investigation of all the facts and supported by the testimony of the surviving Japanese leaders involved, it is the survey's opinion that certainly prior to 31 December 1945, and in all probability prior to 1 November 1945, Japan would have surrendered even without the bomb. Of course, it's unclear that Allied intelligence had the information to draw that conclusion the previous July. The choice of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as targets was also complicated. As I already mentioned, Nagasaki was a secondary target. Hiroshima was ultimately selected for a couple of reasons. It was mostly untouched as of July 1945. That meant, in part, it would be easy for scientists to measure just how destructive the bomb really was once it was deployed against a real city. Hiroshima also had strategic value. It was a major port and home to some munitions factories. Kyoto was briefly on the table, but one of the men on the committee had visited Kyoto and understood its historic, religious, and cultural significance. He ultimately talked President Truman into removing the city from the list of possible targets. Nagasaki was added to the list to replace Kyoto. Nagasaki's strategic value was that it was one of Japan's largest shipbuilding and repair centers. On July 26th, the Allies offered Japan a choice. Harry Truman, Winston Churchill, and Chinese Chairman Chiang Kai-shek issued the Potsdam Declaration. It ended, quote, "We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces, and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction." Japan ignored the Potsdam Declaration, and the U.S. went ahead with plans to use the atomic bomb. We opened this episode with the events of the bombings themselves. The August 6, 1945 bombing of Hiroshima likely killed between 66 and 140,000 people instantly and injured another 100,000. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, the bombing of Nagasaki likely killed between 22 and 75,000 people instantly and injured another 60,000. What did things look like on the ground? In Hiroshima, Little Boy exploded with the energy of about 16 kilotons of dynamite, and it destroyed virtually everything within a 1.6 kilometer, 1 mile, radius. Over 2/3 of the city's buildings were demolished. Those 100,000 injured people needed medical help, but 90% of Hiroshima's medical personnel had been killed or injured. Radioactive ash seeded clouds over Hiroshima, causing black rain to fall over the city for almost 2 hours after the explosion. One victim later wrote that escapees thought the Americans were dumping gasoline on the survivors of Hiroshima. The rain was almost as thick as tar and sometimes caused severe radiation burns. In Nagasaki, Fat Man exploded with about 88 terajoules of energy. It was a far stronger explosion than the bomb at Hiroshima. It's only because the crew accidentally dropped the bomb into the narrow Urakami Valley that the damage and casualties weren't far more extensive. Nevertheless, more than 40% of Nagasaki was destroyed. Most of Nagasaki's medical personnel were also killed or injured. Some people in both cities looked uninjured, but showed bizarre symptoms: nausea, internal bleeding, hair loss, fever, purple patches breaking out all over their bodies. 36-year-old actress Midori Naka was the first official death from what was initially called atomic bomb sickness. She died on August 24, 1945. Today, hers is the first death to be officially certified as the result of radiation poisoning. Again, we'll probably never know the exact number, but one atomic bomb casualty commission report estimates that almost 7,000 people likely died of acute radiation syndrome in Hiroshima within a month of August 6th. A similar number likely died of the same cause in the same period in Nagasaki. Survivors of Hiroshima and/or Nagasaki soon came to be known as hibakusha, literally survivor of the bomb, or person affected by exposure. I say and/or because there were a small number of Niju hibakusha, the twice-bombed, those who escaped Hiroshima and attempted to find safety in Nagasaki. The suffering for hibakusha after the bomb was dropped was, unfortunately, twofold. Not only did they deal with a lifetime of health complications, and it was often a shortened lifetime, but also a lifetime of prejudice. One of the greatest challenges for hibakusha was that radiation sickness was not only poorly understood, but also unpredictable. Acute radiation sickness killed huge numbers of survivors. In the intermediate stage, from 10 to 12 weeks after exposure, victims were likely to lose their hair, develop weeping skin blisters, and suffer from radiation pneumonia, which was often lethal. Some men and women were rendered temporarily or permanently sterile. After 12 weeks, a hibakusha's risk of immediate death began to decline, but for the rest of their lives, they were at elevated risk of miscarriage, cataracts, and, more alarmingly, leukemia and cancer. One epidemiology study estimates that from 1950 to 2000, radiation sickness may have caused 46% of leukemia deaths and 11% of solid cancers among Japan's hibakusha. There has also been a long-standing prejudice against hibakusha in Japan. Most of that prejudice is based on rumors and bad public health information. There are misunderstandings about how radiation sickness works, that it might be hereditary or even contagious. So many hibakusha struggled to find jobs or housing. A large number of hibakusha, especially women, found it almost impossible to marry non-hibakusha because so many people feared their children would have birth defects. They didn't. Now, it is true that some of the women who were pregnant at the time they were exposed to radiation did have children with a specific birth defect. That specific birth defect was microcephaly, or a smaller than normal head size, and microcephaly often causes abnormal brain development. But there is no statistically demonstrable increase of birth defects among hibakusha women who became pregnant after August 1945. Japanese law has an official definition of hibakusha, including exactly where atomic bomb victims had to be on August 6th and 9th. By these official definitions, there were about 650,000 hibakusha. As of March 2023, more than 113,000 were still alive. By the end of this year, 2024, there are expected to be more living hibakusha than living veterans of World War II. Just to be clear, not all hibakusha are Japanese. Many Koreans were working in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the time of the bombings. Some were killed, some survived as hibakusha. About 3,000 Japanese Americans were in Hiroshima on August 6th. And there were several prisoners of war, British, Dutch, and American, who died in or survived the bombings. Kenzaburo Oe edited one of the most important anthologies of atomic bomb literature. It's called The Crazy Iris and Other Stories of the Atomic Aftermath. We'll be referencing The Crazy Iris, Oe's introduction, and the anthologized stories quite a bit in this next section of the podcast episode. In his introduction, Oe commented that, quote, most literature that has taken the A-bomb experience as its basic subject matter has attempted to see the experiences of Hiroshima and Nagasaki A-bomb survivors as a vital factor in the lives and livelihood of all the Japanese people. And that definition is a good start. But what atomic bomb literature consists of has changed over time. The earliest atomic bomb literature writers wrote more documentary accounts of their own experiences. For the most part, these are writers who were already established authors or fully adults at the time of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Later fiction often included the broader social and political issues at play. These are often writers who were teens or children when the atomic bombs went off. Later still, authors wrote about how the very existence of a nuclear bomb affects the existence of a post-nuclear world. Atomic bomb literature also served as a sort of inspiration for Fukushima fiction, and it has spawned other atomic writing or nuclear writing, like Erika Kobayashi's Trinity, 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 that explores the fact of radioactivity as a part of human life. Our story today is primarily about that first and second generation of atomic bomb writing. As you'll see, many of these first and second generation writers were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, and they lived with the stigma of being hibakusha. Some of them later died of radiation illness or cancers linked to their radiation exposure. You can find a pretty thorough list of Japanese fiction that deals with all things atomic and nuclear on the Read Japanese Literature website. The very first work of atomic bomb literature was almost certainly Yoko Ota's story, A Light as If from the Depths. It was published on August 30th, 1945 in the Asahi Shimbun, still one of Japan's most important newspapers. I don't think A Light as If from the Depths has been translated, but I'd be happy to be corrected. Ota went on to become one of the most important voices in atomic bomb literature, but A Light as If from the Depths was virtually the only work of atomic bomb literature published before 1952. Why? In September 1945, American occupiers of Japan instituted a system of censorship. Read Japanese Literature covered censorship during this entire period of Japanese history in depth in the Season 1 episode, Japanese Literature in World War II. The American occupation was run by the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, or SCAP. SCAP authorities had different priorities for what they wanted to censor than Japanese authorities of the 1930s and early 1940s. SCAP's target was writing deemed feudalistic or patriotic, anything occupation leadership thought might support a resurgence of militarism. SCAP was also extremely wary of accounts of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and their aftermath. I'd also like to note the way censorship affected the Japanese people's ability to come to grips with what had happened to them. Not just the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the entire war itself. John Dower wrote one of the most highly regarded English-language books about this time period in Japanese history. It's called Embracing Defeat, Japan in the Wake of World War II. Dower describes how, quote, the need to grieve publicly, to mourn and speak well of the dead, in some instances unsurprisingly transgressed what the censors deemed proper and permissible. For the most part, SCAP censorship wasn't in place all that long. By June 1947, SCAP began to gradually relax control, and by fall 1949, SCAP ended its censorship operations entirely. But mentions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki continued to be strictly limited to objective scientific facts. Very little opinion writing, and only documentary literary works. SCAP didn't even allow the release of photographs of the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki until the early 1950s. There are a few exceptions. Some works were published with amendments that might please SCAP, as we'll discuss in just a minute. Tamaki Hara's 1947 Summer Flower was published in such an obscure journal that no one paid it any attention. That one was translated into English by George Saito in The Crazy Iris. More works of atomic bomb literature began to appear after the American occupation ended in 1952. I, for one, was surprised to learn about the reaction the literary elite had to atomic bomb literature. John Whittier Treat was an associate professor of Japanese at the University of Washington when he wrote what is probably the book on atomic bomb literature in English, Writing Ground Zero, Japanese Literature and the Atomic Bomb. Treat outlines the literary elite's infighting about atomic bomb literature in great detail. I'm relying heavily on his work here. The literary elite, in Japan called the Bundan, were pretty clear that atomic bomb literature wasn't literature at all, and particularly not high or pure literature. And the Japanese term there is junbungaku. That term may ring a bell if you're a long-time listener. I suppose it didn't help that writers from Hiroshima and Nagasaki obviously weren't from Tokyo. Among the literary elite, there was a generations-long prejudice against writers not from Tokyo. I didn't notice Treat mentioning sexism, but surely it was a factor too. Many of the most prominent atomic bomb writers were women, and two of the authors most involved in the debates about whether atomic bomb literature was literature were women. First Yoko Ota and then Kyoko Hayashi. But maybe most importantly, the Bundan was still committed to the idea that Junbungaku followed the I-novel model. Read Japanese Literature covered the I-novel in some depth in a Season 1 episode, but to summarize, an I-novel is an autobiographical or semi-autobiographical confessional work. It is widely regarded as one of the greatest achievements of 20th century Japanese literature. Sincerity is one of the most important characteristics of an I-novel. In this case, sincerity is a willingness to lay it all out there, no matter how ugly or unpleasant. All of that might sound like it would fit perfectly with a raw story about the horrors of surviving the atomic bomb. But the Bundan also held that pure literature should be devoid of any sullying historical or social consciousness extending beyond that of a privileged and withdrawn bourgeois subject. Not only was atomic bomb literature firmly rooted in a horrifying historical moment, the authors were increasingly interested in exploring the political aftermath. Issues like just how much America was to blame and how Japan was rejecting the hibakusha victims. Today, opinions about atomic bomb literature in Japan are generally much more moderate. Still, it isn't always a celebrated or widely read part of Japan's literary history. There are far too many atomic bomb writers for me to talk about all of them today, or even to acknowledge them all by name. Instead, I'm going to mention some of the most prominent who are available in English translation. As I've already mentioned, there's a much more comprehensive list of who's available in translation on the Read Japanese Literature site, and that list is also linked from the episode page. I'm going to organize this section of the episode by talking first about atomic bomb writers who were hibakusha, first from Hiroshima and then from Nagasaki. And then I'll mention one writer who wasn't hibakusha himself, but who was nevertheless an important atomic bomb writer, both in Japan and in English translation. We've already mentioned Yoko Ota, who lived from 1906 to 1963. Many critics regard Ota as the author of atomic bomb literature. She survived the bombing of Hiroshima. As we already discussed, her story A Light as If from the Depths, published on August 30, 1945, is quite probably the first work of atomic bomb literature. Also in 1945, she wrote a story called City of Corpses. It's her account of her own experiences in Hiroshima. City of Corpses, though, was only published 3 years after she completed it, and it had large portions deleted. You can read City of Corpses in a book called Hiroshima, 3 Witnesses, translated by Richard H. Minier. In 1954, Ota published an untranslated novel called Han Ningen, or Half Human. It's another largely autobiographical account of an author who is haunted by memories of the atomic bomb attack. She lives in fear that she will die of radiation sickness, and she lives in fear of another world war. As I mentioned, this book came out in 1954, still in the kind of early days of the Bundan debate about whether atomic bomb literature was literature. Just to give you an even clearer idea how vast the literary establishment's initial contempt for atomic bomb writers was, let me relay to you how John Treat describes the response to that book. According to Treat, Han Ningen cemented Ota's reputation as, quote, a bitter, disturbed, and perhaps even deranged woman whose writings on Hiroshima deserve to be discounted as equally bitter, disturbed, and deranged themselves. Ota died of a heart attack in 1963. And it's perhaps worth noting that Ota wrote nationalist literature during World War II, and that kind of complicates her legacy. Tamiki Hara lived from 1905 to 1951. He was in Hiroshima in August 1945 to bury the ashes of his recently deceased wife in his family's ancestral grave. Hara spent years resisting Allied censorship and eventually published a great deal of atomic bomb literature. I believe his only translated works are 2 short stories that appear in The Crazy Iris. Hara committed suicide in 1951 after he heard rumors America might use atomic weapons again, this time as a part of the Korean War. The rumors were true, sort of, by the way. The use of atomic weapons was certainly under consideration for months in 1951. There are fewer atomic bomb writers from Nagasaki. There were fewer victims overall, and by coincidence, many professional writers with established careers were sheltering in Hiroshima in August 1945. As a matter of fact, there are only 2 prominent atomic bomb writers from Nagasaki available in English translation, to the best of my knowledge. One of these is Takashi Nagai, who lived from 1908 to 1951. Nagai was a 37-year-old dean of radiology at the University of Nagasaki in August 1945. He wrote what is by far his best-known work, The Bells of Nagasaki, in the summer of 1946. You can read The Bells of Nagasaki in English translation by William Johnston. The Bells of Nagasaki relates Nagai's own harrowing story, the fires that engulfed the University of Nagasaki after the bomb detonated, the efforts of the surviving medical staff, including Nagai, to help the city's wounded, the author's months-long battle with radiation sickness. SCAP didn't authorize the publication of The Bells of Nagasaki until 1949, and that was after the publisher added an appendix describing Japanese atrocities in the Philippines. That appendix has since been removed. Nagai died just 2 years after the book was published. He died of a heart attack prompted by leukemia. The leukemia was linked to exposure to radiation, although it's impossible to tell whether that exposure was due to his work as a radiologist, his status as a hibakusha, or both. Like Ota, Nagai too was a wartime nationalist. Quite frankly, it was relatively difficult not to be a nationalist in World War II Japan. Unlike Ota, though, he wasn't a writer before or during World War II, and so there's not a body of writing serving as a testament to his earlier beliefs, whether or not they were sincerely held. The Bells of Nagasaki is remarkable for a number of reasons. Because Nagai was a radiologist and he was on hand so close to the site at which the bomb was detonated, the book remains, in Treat's words, probably the most scientifically accurate first-hand document of the ground-level effects of nuclear weapons. And The Bells of Nagasaki also reflects Nagai's deeply held Catholic faith. A lot of Nagasaki's atomic bomb literature relies on Christian imagery. Why is that? For historical reasons, Nagasaki is Japan's most Christian city, and it also has a strong association with martyrdom. Here's a fast-forward historical overview. First, the city itself was founded by Catholic Portuguese missionaries in the 16th century. In the late 16th century, the leadership of Japan changed hands several times, and so did policies about the presence of Catholics and Europeans in general. In 1597, During one early period of persecution, 26 Christians were famously arrested, tortured, and crucified on a hill overlooking Nagasaki. Catholics were officially banned once and for all in 1614. And so many Japanese and foreign Christians were executed by public crucifixion and burning at the stake in the city of Nagasaki. Christianity remained illegal in Japan until the second half of the 19th century. Christian missionaries returned to Japan, and it was a surprise to more or less everyone when about 200,000 Christians, descendants of Japan's 17th century Christians, came out of hiding over the next several years. A large number of Japan's hidden Christians lived in Nagasaki Prefecture. One of the biggest concentrations of hidden Christians was in the Urakami neighborhood of Nagasaki, where 19th century Catholic missionaries discovered almost all the locals were secret Christians. Christianity is certainly a religion rich with symbolic possibilities, and these symbolic possibilities come up often in Japanese literature, even written by non-Christians. In atomic bomb literature from Nagasaki, it's almost always Christian writers using this symbolism. We see historical comparisons between Japanese Christians hiding their religious identities and atomic bomb victims hiding their status as hibakusha. In a remarkable play by Nagasaki native Chikao Tanaka called The Head of Mary, there's a group of Nagasaki Christians who want to steal what remains of the statue of Mary from Urakami Cathedral. They want to do this as an act of restoring their faith. The play has been translated by David G. Goodman in a book called After Apocalypse, 4 Japanese Plays of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I have read it. It is both gorgeous and heartbreaking. There's also an uncomfortable association between death by atomic bomb and Christian martyrdom in some of this literature. I'm going to read this quote by longtime Jesuit resident of Japan and the translator of The Bells of Nagasaki, William Johnston. Johnston was also a priest. I'll read it without comment to avoid editorializing, because I recognize that the experience of these writers and these Christians in Nagasaki is outside of my experience. Quote, "Martyrdom was a glorious act of which the Nagasaki Christians are justly proud, and those who died in the atomic holocaust are no less martyrs than their illustrious ancestors who were crucified on mountains or who died hanging over the sulfur pits of Unzen." The other prominent Nagasaki atomic bomb writer is Kyoko Hayashi, to whom we'll return in the next part of our episode. Masuji Ibuse is probably the most important non-hibakusha atomic bomb author. He lived from 1898 to 1993. He did grow up near Hiroshima, and that context and love for the area enrich his writing. His most famous book, in both Japanese and English, is Black Rain, which was translated by John Bester. The novel is a frame narrative. The protagonist is trying to use his diary entries to prove that his niece wasn't in Hiroshima from August 6th through 15th, 1945. If he can't, his niece may never marry. People are just too afraid of the black rain and the radiation sickness it caused. As I've mentioned, atomic bomb literature is not only important in its own right, but also for the influence it has had on later literature. Its influence is probably most notable on Fukushima fiction. Although Fukushima fiction writers often approach their material very differently, atomic bomb writers set a precedent for using fiction to approach real events, real disasters, that are beyond imagination. I didn't leave myself enough time to talk about Fukushima fiction again today, but Read Japanese Literature has covered it in detail. There's an entire episode about Fukushima fiction. You can find a link on the episode page. And again, if you're interested in the ultimate influence of atomic bomb literature, I highly recommend the work of Erika Kobayashi, especially Trinity, Trinity, Trinity. It really brings together how intertwined all of the world's nuclear disasters really are. Kyoko Hayashi was born in 1930. Hayashi is a pen name, by the way. Her real name was Kyoko Miyazaki. As far as I know, no relation to the famous anime director. Hayashi was born in Nagasaki, but she didn't grow up there. When she was just a year old, her family moved to Shanghai for her father's work at Mitsui Industries. When Japanese defeat loomed on the horizon, Hayashi's family returned to their hometown in March 1945. Hayashi enrolled in Nagasaki Girls High School and was soon mobilized in the Mitsubishi munitions factory. She was at work in the factory when the atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. She turned 15 years old just a few days later. Hayashi escaped from the ruins of the city, but she was seriously ill for 2 months and never fully recovered her health. There isn't as much biographical information as I would have liked available in English about Hayashi. Very little in particular about her life from 1945 to 1960. I can tell you that she was seriously ill and that she married and then divorced after what John Treat described as a singularly unsuccessful marriage. Hayashi began writing in 1962. In 1975, Kyoko Hayashi won the Akutagawa Prize for her story Ritual of Death. The narrator of Ritual of Death is more or less autobiographical. Like Hayashi, the narrator is 14 years old on August 9, 1945, and she has been ordered to work in the Mitsubishi munitions factory. The story comes to an end in October 1945, shortly after school reopens. Many of her former classmates are dead. Some of her classmates who attend the opening ceremony die of radiation sickness soon afterward, or are sick enough that they may die. The narrator attends that ceremony against her doctor's advice. The narrative closes with words the story recognizes are ironic. Thus, the destruction came to an end. In all of Hayashi's work, the destruction of Nagasaki goes on and on. After Ritual of Death, a lot of Hayashi's writing turned to life for hibakusha after 1945. In particular, Hayashi's driven by two grave issues for hibakusha: the long-term effects of radiation exposure on her own health and the health of her offspring. Hayashi had one son. She seems to have been constantly afraid he would develop symptoms of radiation sickness too. And the fact that she survived when so many people did not. Hayashi continued to write and work as an anti-nuclear activist for the rest of her life. And it was a long life. She lived to be 86 years old and only died in 2017. Today, I want to talk about Hayashi's story, Masks of Whatchamacallit. The Japanese title comes from the Kanto region expression Nanja Monja no Men, meaning, what sort of thing is this, or what the hell is this? Quite frankly, I'm still not entirely sure why Kyoko Selden uses the word masks in her translation of the title. I'm sure she has a good reason. I just don't personally get it. Masks of Whatchamacallit was published in 1976, the year after Hayashi won the Akutagawa Prize for Ritual of Death. As we just discussed, Ritual of Death is a more or less autobiographical story about August to October 1945. Masks of Whatchamacallit is a little less autobiographical, but still grounded in Hayashi's own experiences. Most of the story takes place in the 1960s, and the first-person narrator is an atomic bomb survivor who is now in her 30s. The story opens not with the narrator, but with another character named Takako. In just the opening paragraphs of the story, the reader learns that Takako has died. In October 1974, when she was 45 years old, the cause of death was cancer of the liver or of the pancreas, according to some, from A-bomb after effects. We'll come to know Takako fairly well in the next 20 pages, but we know from the story's outset that she is not going to get a happy ending. Takako and the narrator met as teenagers when they were both forced to work at an arms factory, just like Hayashi. The story skips back and forth in time, but the structure of the story is based on the narrator's memory of her last meeting with Takako, probably in the early 1960s. The main theme is how the health consequences of radiation sickness have shaped these women's entire lives, especially Takako's. In August of 1945, immediately after the bombing, Takako suffers from every single one of the initial symptoms of radiation poisoning: green diarrhea and vomiting, a sense of lethargy all over the body, then eventually purple spots, lost hair, spitting blood, high fever, skin eruptions. Takako eventually has months-long menstrual-like bleeding. This story is very much focused on how both the main characters are women. The narrator is left waiting for the same symptoms to happen to her. "You'll lose your hair too," Takako tells her. "It can't be that you're the only special case." The narrator never does lose her hair, but she does develop symptoms: pus-filled red spots all over her body. Schoolgirls her own age jeer at her on her way to and from the hospital for treatment. Unlike Takako, the narrator hadn't started her period before the bombing. She had looked forward to it. Many girls do. For many women, it's a sign of growing up and a sign that a woman can have children someday. But now, when the narrator starts bleeding, both she and her mother are terrified. Quote, "Her mother couldn't determine whether her daughter's menstruation meant normal growth or was due to bleeding caused by the A-bomb disease. The bomb has robbed the narrator of an understanding of her body and of the privilege of celebrating her biological sex the way she had always wanted to." Both women eventually decide to marry. Takako's husband initially doesn't seem to care about her status as a hibakusha, and initially this seems like a kind way of going about things. He says, "The war damaged more or less all of us who lived through it." But when Takako gets pregnant, her husband all but insists that she have an abortion. And he does this with some pretty eugenicist language. "Wouldn't you say it's our responsibility to leave superior people for future generations?" Takako gives into the pressure her husband is putting on her and has the abortion. She's far enough along in her pregnancy, it isn't a safe operation. She survives. Afterward, the doctor informs her that her baby had been perfectly healthy. When she tells her husband this, his response to the news that he coerced his wife into a dangerous abortion of a healthy fetus really puts the final nails in the coffin of their relationship. He tells her she is as much to blame as he is and explains why he's been growing more distant. "Before I realized it," he says, "I was as involved in your A-bomb disease and found myself looking at our unborn child with the mentality of a victim. I have had enough of former soldiers begging on the train, and I have had enough of your A-bomb disease." I am not adding those quotation marks. They are in the text. They are in what her husband says. He does not believe that Takako has an ongoing affliction. Her husband thinks all Japanese are scarred, her wounds are nothing special, And like many Japanese of his generation, he would prefer to pretend like the war never happened. The hibakusha make that almost impossible. The narrator has also married, and she has a son. Her husband was generally more supportive than Takako's husband. It would be rather difficult not to be. But the narrator is a bit haunted by the fact that her husband rushed into the room after their son was born to count their newborn's fingers and toes. It was only after he found 10 of each that he expressed real excitement about their newborn child. The narrator is hurt, although she does understand. By the time Takako and the narrator meet up in the early 60s, Takako spends a lot of her time volunteering with mentally and physically disabled children. Takako tells the narrator it's fine for healthy children and handicapped children to be as they are. The mixture is what humans are. After all, she says to the narrator, if the value of human life were forgotten, August 9th would be meaningless. At the end of the story, the narrator returns to the 1970s after Takako has died. The narrator fears she will again follow the course of Takako's radiation sickness, and once again, she has survived when another victim, someone she cared about, has died. So why read atomic bomb literature? Atomic bomb literature is an important memorial to the victims of the American bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hibakusha accounts provide some of the strongest evidence that the use of nuclear weapons is just wrong. And they also provide an opportunity for the victims of the bombings to speak for themselves. Atomic bomb writing has also shaped the Japanese literature that has followed it, especially in the narratives after the 3/11 triple disasters. Our focus text today has been Masks of Whatchamacallit by Kyoko Hayashi, translated by Kyoko Selden. Once again, you can read it online completely for free, and there's a link on the episode page. If you want to support Read Japanese Literature, please consider buying your books from our bookshop.org bookshop. You can also support the podcast by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice. We're trying to expand to more apps, by the way. Please contact Read Japanese Literature if you're trying to listen on an unsupported app. The best way to support Read Japanese Literature is through Patreon for as little as $3 a month. All paid subscribers get early access and bonus content with every episode. They also get a weekly newsletter with Read Japanese Literature updates and news about new releases of Japanese literature in translation. A special thank you to Read Japanese Literature's new supporters and patrons, Deborah S., Terry W., and Maya S. Again, I do the labor for Read Japanese Literature entirely unpaid, but it costs about $90 a month just to keep the podcast and website running and publicly visible. Join the folks who keep Read Japanese Literature running and ad-free at patreon.com/Read Japanese Literature. We'd love to hear from you about the podcast, and there are so many ways to stay in touch. We're now on Facebook. Search for Read Japanese Literature or follow the link on the website through the contact page. The website is readjapaneseliterature.com. As always, you can contact us through the website or Patreon. We're on YouTube /@ReadJapaneseLiterature, Blue Sky @readjapaneselit.bsky.social, and Instagram @ReadJapaneseLit. A special thank you today to Professor Alyssa Friedman at the University of Oregon. Her summer class through Sophia University introduced me to Hayashi and Masks of Whatchamacallit. And thank you, as always, to producer Kime for today's music, kimemusic.com.